Good vibrations.
And welcome to another episode. My guest today is going to be getting into the links between the British arm of MK Ultra mind control research, also LSD, and the Free Party festival scene of the UK, which in turn is linked to the acid house scene that kicked off pretty much exactly 30 years ago, and with the incredible far-reaching impact that had on youth culture worldwide. So subjects very close to my heart. Welcome to Cathi Morgan. Cathi, hi.
Thank you, Mark.
So you're a researcher and public speaker on the subjects I just outlined, basically MK Ultra, mind control, how that plays out in the UK, and the links to all these other things. And it seems you've got some personal investment in all this and, you know, some quite fascinating stories to tell. So just to set the scene, would you like to give people some brief background into yourself, your life story, and what it was that led to you investigating these kind of subjects and becoming something of an inside whistleblower, I guess?
Sure, yeah. Well, I became aware of MK Ultra probably about 9 or 10 years ago, and I had alarm bells going off thinking, you know, this could be something that's happened, some sort of covert, non-consensual things. I felt they'd happened to me. So I began to research around my family and around life events, asking questions, tracing links. And indeed, it did come up with a lot of information about MK Ultra and the UK, which has been welcomed really by other researchers in England. So after a couple of years, I was invited to share my research, and that's what I did, really thinking, you know, this is important, because for myself, finding these types of covert intervention into people's lives seemed to be a good explanation for me. My life started to make more sense to me then. I'd been quite, I suppose you could say, asleep, really, before that.
Can I just ask, what was it that first prompted you to look into whether you might have a personal involvement in this UK playout of MK Ultra and into your family background detail? What was it that first sent you down that route and towards these discoveries?
It was really more an intuition than any particular facts. In my teenage years and my early 20s, I'd lived sort of the hippie lifestyle. I went to the free festivals and partook in really that emerging scene. Well, it seemed to be emerging. It was probably had been going on. It was about 1974 when I went to my first festival. That was the Windsor Festival.
Right.
And I'd just felt that things hadn't really been as I'd imagined. I imagined that I found it sort of uncomfortable in some ways because of my own issues. But now looking back, I realised it was heavily infiltrated and managed in many instances by intelligence.
Well, let's get into all of that in due course, certainly. But first off, I think most people can understand why celebrities and those in key positions in the public eye, politicians and world leaders and such, would have been subject to mind control programming. But they find it more difficult to understand why this stuff would be done to just regular members of society, people from regular walks of life. What motive do you think there could be for the controllers having programmed subjects everywhere, just going about their daily business? Why would it be so important for them to have these aspects of regular human society under surveillance and control? And could it be military family backgrounds that are the key to who this gets done to?
Well, that's certainly a common factor. However, I had the whole research really sparked off when I got post-traumatic stress from being in a violent relationship, a short but violent relationship. And I recognized by researching post-traumatic stress in order to present my case to the to get sickness benefit for a while, I researched it quite deeply because I was told, no, I was one of the first ATOS sort of victims, if you like, and I was just, no. So I researched PTSD. I recognized I'd have many symptoms growing up and throughout my life. I'd been dissociative, very dissociative, really. I'd run away from home at 15. So I started to look, and I found that there was unusual stuff around my grandparents, who had, my grandmother had talked about a twin being taken away when my mum was born. My mum was a twin, and this other twin, according to my grandmother, was alive, and the priest and the doctor took it. That was a sort of alarm bell. And then we had my mum's cousin, who was, his mother was raised away from the family, and then my mum's cousin went into he became a defence research scientist. He worked reorganising the defence services with Thatcher. He chaired a Commonwealth conference. He was he was working on the Blue Knight and the Blackstreet rockets. So that was another sort of indication. And then I found out that my grandfather's parents both worked for the royal household. So again, a possibility of being picked up there. And what convinced me in the end was that although my sister and I had been part of a fairly regular longitudinal survey, the survey documentation said basically that the children would be contacted at the age of 6 to answer questionnaires, and the parents were given a questionnaire at birth, and there wasn't any other involvement. However, on talking to my parents about it, they said, oh no, we were visited at least every 3 months from birth. So then I sort of researched what the area we moved into at the age of 4, and we'd moved from North Manchester, from Rochdale, in fact, to Swainswick in Bath, and that was only 10 miles from the actual team doing the NCDS survey. So then I started to see if there were any links between the people running those surveys and MK Ultra. So that's when I discovered that there seemed to be a lot of surveys administered by the London School of Economics. They were linked to the Eugenics Society historically, and there were links for sure, to MK Ultra there.
I'm familiar with some TV shows that there have been recently, I think it's on BBC One, where they take a group of selected individuals from childhood and they trace them through their formative years to teenagers into adulthood, and they revisit them every few years to see where they're at in life and what they've been up to. So they're tracing their entire development and making it public. And what you're talking about here seems to be a variation on that. So that's the entertainment version for the public palate. But there's actually a covert version of this that's going on unseen to the general public, sort of behind the scenes for whatever social monitoring purposes.
Yeah, I haven't seen the one on television, but that was exactly the sort of survey. In a way, they were called the National Child Development Surveys. The first one was in 1946. 12 years later, and that was funded by the Eugenics Society. And then 12 years later, in 1958, all children born in a particular week in these years were signed up automatically for the survey. So in 1958, that was 17,000 children. But as I say, the majority of the children were given just really didn't have very much intervention. However, I recall going to appointments in Bath to be with doctors. I presume they were doctors, they had white coats on. And we also, because we lived very close to an underground base, which was actually secret at the time, I was quite intrigued when my mum, that was in Corsham, on the border of Wiltshire and Somerset, that my mum said we did actually get taken to Corsham for some of these appointments, but they also came to our house. So, this was confirming my intuition that there was a lot more had been going on than I'd ever thought,
It certainly sounds like there are military links to all this in terms of how these kids are being selected for this kind of monitoring through their lives. These family backgrounds and links into military intelligence certainly seem to be key to that, rather than it being just some random lottery and just bad luck on the parts of certain individuals. And I bet if you did a bit more digging, you'd find that Freemasonry and other secret society fraternity links wouldn't be far from the surface either. We can only speculate on that, but it wouldn't surprise me if that turned out to be the case.
That's what I'm starting to see. And there certainly was military links to these surveys were born. Solly Zuckerman was an operational research advisor, a very high-level advisor in the Second World War, and he initially did surveys simply getting all the children in Hull to write essays about their experiences of bombing and air raids. And he took those essays and analysed them for the most fearful factors, which then informed the bombing of Dresden. Literally, that's absolutely recorded. They found out that children were most disturbed when they left their homes, for example. So they decided to bomb large areas of working class civilians in Dresden to cause the worst amount of disruption, and also literally said more blood per bomb would be achieved. So that was Solly Zuckerman. Then he was working with one of the 5 members of the team, the main five members of the NCSD team, called James W.B. Douglas. He worked with him since he was a student, and they went on to work together on these surveys.
Okay.
Now, Zuckerman was also closely linked to Sir Henry Tizard, who is known to have attended a meeting in Montreal in 1951 with representatives of the CIA and also a chap called Soland, Solandt, and it was decided that there would be research under Artichoke and Bluebird looking at using sensory deprivation. This is when the sensory deprivation research was planned, and that fed literally. They set up Ewan Cameron from that meeting to do his stuff, but Tizard came back to England, and the officers' mess was based at Oriel College, Oxford, and Tizard was a fellow of Oriel College. Now, Oriel College actually owned most of the village that I had been moved to in Swainswick. The tiny village of Swainswick was virtually totally owned by Oriel College, Oxford. So once you start getting these close, these sort of links and lots of them, then you realise that you really are onto something.
And we've heard so many tantalising stories about the MKUltra project coming out of the CIA and the way that all played out in America, most notably through the LSD-drenched 1960s counterculture scene. But very little is ever said of the British side of this programme. And when you factor in that the very creation of the CIA out of the OSS involved key personnel from British military intelligence, not least Aldous Huxley, because the Huxley family are always up to their eyes in all this nefarious stuff when you get behind the scenes, I guess it stands to reason that much of the social experimentation would be going on in the UK, because that seems to be the origin of most of this stuff in the first place before it's exported to America. So naturally there's going to be a homegrown version of it, which seems to have flown under the radar a bit more. It's the way it's played out in the US that has grabbed headlines and got, truth researchers really engaged. But there's got to be a UK version of this story still waiting to be fully uncovered, right?
Definitely. This is what was actually said at the meeting, was that Britain had many programs underway already, and that there was that the Canadians and the Americans and the CIA were keen to collaborate and share information. So there was a big sharing of sort of information around the hardware, the bombs, the nuclear bombs, and so on. And Tizard was also involved with that. That was related to the Tizard mission. And then came specifically the brainwashing, they called it at the meeting, the brainwashing experiments, another collaboration. So, as I say, Tizard worked closely with Zuckerman, and Zuckerman had worked closely with Julian Huxley, Julian Huxley, and he'd also worked with Aldous Huxley too. And they had made a movie, Julian Huxley and Solly Zuckerman made a movie called Monkey into Man. And now that would have been, I think, in the 40s.
Right.
They made that movie together. Again, it was a eugenic. Zuckerman and Huxley were both zoologists, but what I've discovered is that every single study of any animal or behaviour of animals is specifically to understand humans better. It's not to make the animals more comfortable, I can promise you that.
Right.
Yeah.
To what extent has the Tavistock Institute's name come up in your research into all these areas? Because it does tend to pop up from time to time, I notice, when you get into these kind of affairs. Have you come across any specific involvement from Tavistock?
Yeah, I am finding more and more now about where the Tavistock links in, because it's almost like become like doing a jigsaw now, and some areas are getting filled in, and the Tavistock is a definite area they're linking into all this. It's interesting to look at the origins of how the Tavistock came about, because initially you had something called the Psychopathic Clinic, which became the Portman Clinic, and that was linked to child guidance. So that was there was somebody called Grace Palethorpe, who was a founder of the Institute for Scientific Treatment of Delinquency, which was the precursor to the child guidance clinics, and that was all very much under Tavistock, the child guidance system. So this is where they started to describe certain behaviours as delinquent, and then that gave them the reason to bring the children into the clinics. And then many were brought into care, and of course now we're seeing that there are children brought into care who were treated with a lot of practices that were associated with MKUltra, like being given the truth serum, and being subjected to really what amount to torturous practices. Solitary confinement at a young age, and of course now we have the testimony of many of them that there was organised sexual abuse going on as well. So you can start to see how really it's almost like it's MKUltra is throughout the establishment. It almost is like in the UK, it is the establishment. It's undoubtedly there were extremities and there was black operations, like, say, for example, Cathi O'Brien, who's a presidential model, and she was abused by high-level characters. But I think it then spreads out. So in the UK, you'd have a more visible side of things, which can be reinterpreted now in the light of, history as being linked to the MKUltra practices.
I think the overall gist of the story is that all of this goes so much deeper than we ever thought. I think a lot of people would have entertained the idea that mind control programming would have been present with certain celebrities, with actors, musicians, politicians, also in military deployments in areas such as super soldiers and programmed assassins, but nobody would have expected it to have gone so deep as to involve regular members of society in all walks of life. I think that's the thing we could take away from all of this.
Yes, it becomes clear. And also, this was in the minutes of that meeting in Montreal in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel on the 1st of June, 1951. They actually alluded to that the research would be used for social control. And I think ultimately that was the goal of MK was the control of entire populations.
Right.
And so we have the mind control via the programming of the programs on television is literally was always intended to control and shape society. I've even got people discussing how children's comics were used as a vehicle to instill ideas that they wanted people to adopt. You know, they used children's comics for that.
So MK Ultra is still alive and well, you would say? I mean, the official story is that it was retired sometime in the 1970s, but I've never bought that, and I know a lot of people don't. So alive and well today as it ever was, I guess. Definitely.
And of course, now you do have the psychotronic aspects of it, which are quite disturbing, really, because they're not, you can't taste it, see it, touch it, smell it, but it can they have the ability, and they have done for 40 or 50 years, recorded and documentation that they've had the ability to speak to you inside your head, if you like, when nobody else can hear, and make you think it's your own thoughts. Those kind of abilities have been with us a long time. And of course, when you see the frequencies being used to calm rioters, it makes you realize how easy it would be to, I think that they actually did try different frequencies on different sections of the population and noted the reactions, and that they've been experimenting on those types of issues too.
Does this connect in at all with the concept of TIs, targeted individuals? Because I've heard many testimonies from people who claim that they have constant surveillance. They have helicopters tailing them wherever they go. They have cars following them in the streets. They say that strangers look at them funny on trains and in public places, and sometimes they come up to them and interact with them in some way, and they're just constantly being monitored. Is that the same kind of thing that we're talking about here, TIs?
The TIs are definitely a direct result of those kind of experiments. It's a very fascinating area because clearly some of them are absolutely, spot on when they're describing their experiences. And yet it's difficult to understand how such things can be perpetrated on an individual, or what would be the benefit of it to somebody. I suppose just fine-tuning the equipment would be one quite valid reason for targeting an ordinary person, to calibrate the equipment, if you like. And of course we have the obvious false flag events. Now, those sort of people do seem to be mind controlled too, and they often come from relatively ordinary backgrounds. They're not celebrities, let's say. So, yeah, it's a fascinating, subject. There's so much more to find out about how and why it's perpetrated.
Well, yeah, it's interesting to reflect on whether these individuals could be deployed to take part in these false flag hoaxes. As the participants involved, that would be one reason for all this being done, I guess. And when it comes to targeted individuals and their claims and their accounts, It's obviously very difficult to verify what they're saying. There's very rarely any proof or documentary evidence to back up their claims. So a lot of it is down to taking on their testimonies and taking them at face value. And you could be sceptical about that, but at the same time, you're conscious of not wanting to sound disbelieving or non-sympathetic if their stories are genuine. But it's very difficult to be able to quantify it and tell the difference.
It's very difficult one to come to terms with, and also I can sort of feel that you could be subjected to a number of interventions and then imagine that everything is part of it, because you've got no sort of anchor, no direction, no compass in those kind of circumstances. So other people that are sort of all kind of twitching and winking at you or coughing and poking their noses, are they really sending secret signals, or are you just being quite justifiably paranoid because of the other stuff that's going on? It's hard. You have to take each case on its individual basis, actually. But I would say that if you're a TI, if you look into your background and the background of your parents and grandparents, you probably find stuff. Yeah.
So let's get into some of these music festivals then, which I'm fascinated to hear about, because the stories of the likes of Woodstock and the Human Beings and the Monterey Pop Festival over in the States have been very well documented, but it seems there's more to know about the original British music festivals, which you don't hear talked about so often, at least in terms of their origins. So the likes of Glastonbury, which first emerged in 1970, the Isle of Wight festivals, they kicked off in 1968. They were part of the British side of the counterculture, and the Windsor Festival, which you mentioned you first attended in 1974. What more can we say about what these events, which were the original prototypes for all the British music events that followed, festivals, what they might really have been getting used for?
Well, I know that that Thatcher was, there was a big programme when Thatcher was in power to infiltrate subversive groups. So in that list was the free festivals. There were three components. There were the union activists, there were West Indians, Jamaicans and so on, and then there was the free festival. So they were literally considered to be a prime target for infiltration. And those people at the festivals, I don't know if it's like that now, but we were clearly being photographed from helicopters all the time. They were constantly flying over. The police were taking all the numbers, the registration numbers of people attending them. So there was that was very visible. And talking to organisers of festivals now, I spoke to the organisers of Deeply Vale, and I said, did you see any evidence of infiltration? And they said, yeah, we would be photocopying an event, the details of an event one evening, and by the next morning the police would know about it, So they were trying to put on these events and the police were trying to stop them, so they were trying to be secret about it, but they always seem to find out inexplicably. So it seemed crazy at the time to think that people could be working undercover to such an extent, but I think they actually were,
Is it your view that events like the Glastonbury and Isle of Wight festivals started out organically enough, innocently enough, with benevolent kind of aims, and they were infiltrated somewhere along the way and steered off down a particular direction, rather than having been created in the first place to have some kind of nefarious effect on the festival goers?
I'd say there was influence right from the start, but of course you would have a lot of innocent people thinking that it was organic and it was a rebellion. It was we were being anti-establishment, whereas to think that the establishment was shaping these things is just mind-blowing. For someone who was there and imagining that we were sort of doing something completely free and new, and now it seems like we weren't really.
So do you think the same thing was going on here with these music festivals as was the case with Woodstock and Monterey Pop and stuff over in the US? This was just the British twist on that particular blueprint that was being applied here in its own way.
I personally think that's what will emerge. That evidence of that will emerge. It's very interesting looking at some of the figures involved. I know that there was a chap called Nick Carr-Saunders, who was quite active in getting the festivals together in the alternative scene in London, and his dad was a huge top guy in the London School of Economics, who was involved in eugenics and surveys and so on. So, it's almost reminiscent of when Dave McGowan looked at Laurel Canyon and found the military parents of the people who were producing the rock music, like the Doors and Zappa and Crosby, Stills and Nash and so on. And when you start to look, I think, at the English scene and look at whose people's parents were, I think we're going to find another sort of remarkable fact that the parents were sort of involved with population monitoring and eugenics. We've got Arabella Churchill, of course. She's the well-known one who was instrumental in starting the Glastonbury Festival. And I'm sure in all her innocence, but I mean, look at the calibre of her parents and their connections.
Well, it's certainly a red flag, or it is to me anyway. And it seems with Glastonbury in particular, there's a lot to know about it. It seems suspect due to the fact that it's the only one of the many annual music festivals in the UK that gets full BBC, TV and radio coverage. There's many events they could have chosen, but they've settled on Glastonbury. It also has the pyramid stage, and it occurs around the time of the summer solstice, so you've got all these esoteric and occult aspects to it as well, and it just seems that there's a lot going on there.
Absolutely, yeah, you've said it there. And of course it became so huge as well so quickly, because it was, when it first started, there were festivals in a lot of places. There was Glastonbury, the small Glastonbury. I was there in 75 now, you didn't have to pay. But the same people would then move on to another festival and then another one and another one and so on for the whole summer. Wales, there were festivals there that I went to. And of course the Stonehenge Festival. They all seem to lose that sort of idealism and there was a sense of them, being in nature and quite innocent, and that went very quickly. That disappeared very quickly.
Was that the main appeal to you of attending these events?
Yeah, it was. Excuse me. It was just. It felt like a real alternative, a real new beginning. I was kind of a bit dissociative myself though at these festivals. I was a bit spaced out, I think I'd run away at 15 and taken acid, and then it took me a couple of years to really come back to reality, I think. But excuse me, but my boyfriend at the time organised us to go there. He organised everything, and I've actually found NK Ultra links in his background too. Wow. That was another reason. His godfather, who was a close friend of his father, worked with Dr. Andrei Japahovic, who was an MK Ultra doctor, who designed a radio tooth implant. It was one of his, one of the things that he did. And my partner's godfather, Brian Inglis, was involved with Cohart when he brought Uri Geller to the UK, and Inglis was also close with Arthur Kessler and other interesting people, like a chap who's so Inglis, Kessler, and a chap called Bloomfield started a foundation together. And Bloomfield was a member of this 1001 Club, they're called. I don't know if you've heard of the 1001 Club. They are a sort of more obscure secret. They have quite a few similar people to the Bilderbergers. So Prince Bernhard, who's involved with starting the Bilderbergers, was also running the 1001 Club. And they are focused on setting up these huge national parks in Africa that are built over some of the most richly resourceful, the area with sort of precious metals and diamonds and so on. And so they're really quite dodgy, really, very dodgy.
Right. What about the Windsor Festival? Because I'm familiar with the other ones, but I don't really know much about that one. Is that along similar lines to Glastonbury and the Isle of Wight?
Yes, it was. That was kind of the first festival. I'm not sure if what came before Glastonbury or after. It could well have come before. There was a chap called. It was called. There was these people called the Wallies of Stonehenge, and they decided to take Stonehenge back and that it belonged to the people. And when they went to court, because they were all arrested, they didn't actually give their names. They gave Wally as their name. Each one had a Wally sort of nickname. So one of these Wallies went on to called Phil Russell, who was also called Wally Ho, went on to start the festival in the Queen's Back Garden, which was Windsor. And unfortunately, he was arrested just a week or two before the first Windsor Festival and put into a psychiatric hospital and was dead within about 3 or 4 months because of the treatment he got there. So that's the other aspect of what was going on at the time was the psychiatry, the barbaric practices that were happening around sort of William Sargent as the better known person who was doing the electric shock, the experimentation on patients really to try and repattern them or give them a new personality. All that was going on as well at that time.
Do you know much about Michael Eavis, the founder of Glastonbury? I mean, was he just this innocent farmer, landowner that got caught up in this whole thing and swept along with it? Or was there stuff to know about his background from the start? I just wonder if you've looked into him.
No, I haven't got that far with with the 70s yet, because I am moving into looking at the 70s now, because I first of all decided to go right back to my grandparents, look at events around their lives, and then moved on to my parents and the 50s, which I've been more focused on those early decades. And I'm working my way through. So I'm going to look much more at the free festivals in England now. Now, one connection I was interested in was that one of the main figures in starting these early festivals was a chap called Syd Barrett, and he'd been in contact with John Lennon, and John Lennon had donated an island off the coast of Ireland for them to start a community at. And so prior to starting the free festivals, they had this island, and they took to it became popular with people who wanted to do the primal scream type of therapy on themselves. So they had quite a reputation amongst the Irish locals as the screamers, and there was sort of all sorts of rumours about the mind control going on over there, but who knows how much of that was true and how much was speculation. But I think that whole now that primal scream type of therapy is linked to Tavistock, actually. It was what was he called now? The name escapes me, but he wrote a book called The Primal Scream, and I heard, I find it really fascinating, that era, but it's hard to kind of unpick it. It's a slow process, really, because I think it's, you have to be so rigorous about keeping track of the documentation, the links that you're finding, and so on, because it's such a way out subject area. You can't just talk off the top of your head to people about these things. It just sounds crazy,
Oh yeah, you've got to have your research straight and your citations and references for sure. I'm very interested in this island which you say John Lennon donated to this sort of experimental community. I just wonder how he would have been in a position to bequeath that island. I mean, did he own it, or was he the custodian of it or something? How was it in his possession?
Yeah, he did own it. Syd said he didn't really have much contact with John Lennon, but John Lennon did actually contact him and say, I'm not going to give you, don't ask me for any money, but you can have the island, you're welcome to it. Now, I think Paul McCartney, the Beatles had talked about buying an island, and I think they definitely talked about buying an island elsewhere, and maybe they did buy an island elsewhere. Perhaps the one in Ireland was considered to be too barren and cold, and so they decided to look elsewhere and offload it with the hippies, as it were, But there's always, do you know, Mark, I think all these things that get co-opted and hijacked, there's always a very positive aspect to them that begins organically. So the free festivals, it was the people wanting to reclaim the land that they felt was stolen, and which of course was stolen from us. Syd was associated with a group called the Diggers, maybe a new incarnation of an older group. Right.
Wasn't Peter Coyote involved in that, the actor over in California?
Quite possibly. I don't know. But I do know that anybody that gets a group together and says, okay, we're going to reclaim the land, and starts attracting a lot of attention, is going to attract the attention of the authorities. But in this case, the authorities didn't just shut them down, but they infiltrated them and used them, by the looks of it, for their own agenda. I mean, it was perfect for trying out the LSD side of things. That will be interesting to look into too.
What sort of timescale are we looking at in terms of this island being donated by John Lennon? Would this be late 1960s?
Yeah. It was before the 70s. It was before the three festivals.
And also, I'm very interested in this story of Syd and his association with a squat in Dublin, where Syd Barrett of Pink Floyd was living for a time. And Syd Barrett is generally thought of as having gone mad through doing too much LSD. But I think when you get into his family background and you put it in the correct context, there could be other reasons which would account for his loss of sanity when you really get into it. But this sounds like a fascinating story. Can you tell me some more about that?
Yeah, that's just something I've come across that I decided I really want to look into this, because it was a house on Mount Merrion Street in Dublin that was a squat, and associated with both Syd was associated with that squat, and Syd Barrett had been there, living there for a while. So you have that island off the coast of Ireland, you have the squat in Dublin, no doubt linked. So I do want to look into, how Syd Barrett came to be connected with this, because I'm interested in how, I suppose they can't hide everything. How people in Ireland that I knew about the festivals in England, and it seems to be via this Irish connection. So that's something I'm going to look into. But as I say, up to now, I've been looking into the 50s and earlier, but because I'm tracing my own life and events in my own life, the festivals feature prominently in research that I'm about to do now. I want to look. I think that we'll find CIA connections there. So yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, I don't think I'd fall out of my seat in surprise to discover that was the case. And Syd Barrett's father, Dr. Max Barrett, was involved in research at Cambridge University, which is one of the real hotbeds of mind control research in the UK, and he was working on various projects on behalf of the British government. So once again, we have a family connection through the father between a prominent rock musician and expressions of the government and military intelligence research. Not the first, and I'm sure it won't be the last. What about the drugs at these early music festivals then? I guess LSD would have been the prominent one, but there would have been others as well. Is there anything to suggest that this stuff was being foisted upon the festival goers by certain intel agencies with ulterior motives behind getting all these kids hooked on these drugs and tripping out?
That does seem, excuse me, that does seem to be logical. So I would expect to find that. And when you research the variations of LSD, for example, that the CIA came up with and tested on volunteers, some of them, I mean, it wasn't just LSD. They were looking into the way that these substances interacted with the brain, which neurotransmitters were affected, so they could tweak the drugs to get different effects. So I think this business where you've got so-called bad acid, I think you probably will find that the military chemists would be trying all different sort of flavors, if you like, of effects. They probably had a very sophisticated understanding of the chemistry behind it, even in those days. So, these days now it will be even way more fine-tuned. Because we know that it's pretty much documented now that a lot of the majority of the world's acid was actually coming out of Wales at one time, and that was associated with the people who were later busted in Operation Julie, and that it did include a chap who was American, or who was associated with the CIA, called Ronald Hadley Stark. So you do have that CIA connection there for starters,
What about, has your research taken you into the free party scene of the late 80s, early 90s, tied in with the acid house scene, where ecstasy would have been the drug of choice? So suddenly it was all about MDMA, known as E, which was prevalent at all these warehouse parties and open-air raves that constituted that whole scene. Have you looked into that time period at all?
No, I haven't looked at all at that. I was busy having babies, but by then, being the sort of archetypal hippie and Earth Mother, I had 7 children, so I'd withdrawn really from the festival scene by then. Yeah.
I'm really interested in trying to get a fix on where all the ecstasy pills came from that were such a big part of that late 80s, early 90s scene in Britain, because it's so much easier to trace where all the LSD was coming from with the counterculture scene of the 60s, but it's very difficult to get provable documentary evidence to show where all the E's were coming from in this British scene. Certainly they were everywhere, and there were hundreds of thousands of these pills getting distributed to clubs and raves and festivals every single weekend in their heyday. But in terms of where they were all coming from, because it was a never-ending supply, it's much more difficult to quantify. I don't know if you have any insights into that.
That's interesting. Yeah, certainly. Look into that when I get to the sort of that era. Well, when I start looking at the festivals, but often it's, if you can look into the sort of academic published research, like chemistry, behaviorism, psychiatry, sometimes you pick up stuff that way, information that way. I'm great at reading medical documents now. Scanning them to get the information out, and the people that were sort of the scientists that were working on those things, like there's something called, I think it's HT5, which is a neurotransmitter which they initially discovered before finding things that would interact with it, which was LSD and other sort of consciousness-raising things. So you start digging around in the chemistry side of things, you can sometimes pick stuff up,
Sure.
More clues.
So have you been able to regain any memories of what may have happened to you in early life that may have been suppressed and buried in the subconscious? Because you mentioned it's like putting the pieces to a jigsaw together. in terms of trying to get the big picture and understand what had gone on. Have you had any kind of recollections which have come to light recently, which may have been buried deep?
Yeah, well, once I'd sort of established that lots of unusual things happened that all seemed to be related, like moving down to be close to the team, near the underground base. I noted that there were a lot of twins in our school, which was actually a Jesuit school. So then my memories, I put my memories in a different context then. So memories that you just sort of have with you all your life and don't think anything about sort of re-emerged. For example, I as a very small child, I had a dream which had a recurring dream which had details in it that actually were. I dreamt that my father was with a group of what I called wizards, and they were making him do something that was quite obscene, which was I found out was actually part of a satanic ritual. So it's called corpophilia, and I was dreaming that I was taken from my bed and brought to this place, and there were men in robes, and my dad was made to do this as part of an initiation. Now, to me now that is the red flag for it having some grounding in reality, because my dad actually did become. So we moved to Bath from Rochdale, and then my father became a paedophile, and he was hanging around with sort of trying to get ahead. He was hanging around with sort of the local MP who lived at the bottom of our street, our neighbour, and Peter Parker became a director of my dad's company. So Peter Parker was linked to Jimmy Savile and Prince Philip. Wow. Very closely linked to Prince Philip. Peter Parker's wife started the False Memory Association in England, the British False Memory Association. And in America, we know that the False Memory Association was started by MK Ultra doctors as a sort of plausible deniability for people's recollections, people recalling that they've been experimented on. They said, oh no, that's a false memory that's been implanted, It's quite brutal, really, for people trying to get justice. So lots of stuff like that, yeah.
What you just said there put me in mind of Adam Ant's father. Adam Ant's real name was Stuart Goddard, and his father, I think, was Alfred Leslie Goddard. And he was exposed as a paedophile. He was part of a network that involved this guy, Sidney Cook, and there were links going into Jimmy Savile as well, and all these parliamentary paedophiles, and that Dolphin Square network. So Adam Ant's father did some jail time for that. Adam Ant's mother worked as a cleaner for a short time for Paul McCartney, in inverted commas, which is quite intriguing. And Adam Ant himself is a very interesting character because he's bipolar by his own admission. He's gone on interviews and talked quite openly of his mental illness. But when you consider what goes on in the entertainment industry and what is understood now about mind control programming, there are other explanations for his behaviours and his seemingly dissociative personality disorder. And how interesting that you've got the links into paedophile rings and also the military, because his father served for a time in the military. So it's all the same components that you see time and time again connected back into the world of music.
Oh, absolutely fascinating. Yeah. Because didn't Adam Ant do that amazing video where he smashes, he's got all different altars, the mirror, and that's so symbolic of reintegrating you. Altars.
Absolutely. There are several of his music videos, actually, where there are hints at dissociation and multiple personality disorder. He takes on different personas in the video, playing all these different parts. There are shattered mirrors, as you say, which hint at the shattered dissociative personality of the subject. And also he has a video that was filmed in a Masonic temple with the black and white checkerboard floor, which is a motif that you find in many, many 80s pop videos, actually, which has formed part of the research for my upcoming book.
Absolutely. Because mind control programming, it actually causes a type of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's deliberately cultivated, because people who are in trauma, they're hyper-vigilant and they can have extraordinary talents. Then, it can promote a higher intelligence, it can promote a photographic memory, and so on, which is why public schools are so brutal, and there's trauma going on there, because children function better in the sort of competitive, psychopathic type of, leadership roles. Then that's all linked in with trauma as well.
And it seems so many of the very best Hollywood actors and the very best musicians show all the signs of having been subject to mind control programming. And people might say, well, if they've been mind controlled, how can they perform so well? And wouldn't that impede their performance? Well, I think the opposite is actually true. The devotion to talent, the training, the hours and hours of preparation that are put into it to sharpen the skills and get the performance off to a fine art is actually a byproduct of the programming. It goes hand in hand with it. It's an inevitable play out of what they've been a part of, and that's the reason why they're selected for these prominent positions, because they're the best you can get for it.
Absolutely. And when you're traumatized as a child, one of the symptoms is to feel like exposed, like you're on a stage all the time. So you feel like as if you walk down the street, like everyone's looking at you. So that's perfect for becoming
a performer and an entertainer.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's the natural career path for somebody that's come out of that.
Yeah. And then of course they we have this sort of celebrity culture which is dictated from the television, as it were, and these celebrities just playing along with it, playing right along with it, presumably not fully aware, most of them probably not even aware of how they're being used.
So have you copped any flack since you've decided to speak out about all of this? Have you encountered any difficulties, or have you largely been able to go about your business unaffected?
Yeah, I have not had any targeting particularly. I've not noticed anything. I just always work on the assumption that if there's a mobile phone in the room, anybody could be listening, basically.
Right?
Intelligence services and so on. But I would imagine they've got plenty to be doing. So my sort of starting with the historical research in so much detail, and I wasn't really looking to reach a lot of people. I was just looking to find out my own story and just sharing that. So everything I've been talking about is pretty much in the mainstream document. The documentation is there for it. It's not secret stuff. It's just putting it all together. That is what I've done.
So for those still listening in advance of the date, you're going to be speaking at the AwakeCon conference, taking place in Hampshire in November, Saturday the 11th. I think you're on at 5 p.m. Going to be coming down to take a listen to that. What sort of stuff are you going to be presenting in your talk? Is it going to be largely what we've spoken about in this podcast today, or do you have some different information to put across?
I will just be focusing on what I've spoken about, but more detail, about the historic. I'm still more in tying up the sort of the 50s up until say 1974, really, and perhaps a bit earlier, looking at my grandparents. So looking at all that. So you see, one really interesting thing I found recently was about how children in the Saturday morning cinemas at that time were being closely monitored. The J. Arthur Rank cinema clubs. That was something I meant to bring up, so I'll just say now we find that teams of psychiatrists were putting in certain things into the movies, and they were photographing them with infrared cameras, the audience at the time, to see what their reactions were, so they could better make movies that they could implant ideas into children, basically. And that was the United Nations, UNESCO, that was doing those things. So I'm still going to be concentrating on stuff like that that's emerged, just to try and demonstrate how closely the population were being monitored and manipulated, and how that is documented and that is in the literature, And then I'm going to move on to the 70s, which is going to be fun. Actually, I'm looking forward to researching the 70s era from there onwards.
So that's taken place at Medstead Village Hall, Medstead, Hampshire, over the weekend of the 11th and 12th of November. There's a whole load of speakers there: Thomas Sheridan, Maria Wheatley, David Shaler, a couple of previous Good Vibrations guests, Carl James and Ben Emlyn Jones, and a whole load of other names as well. awakecon.com is the address for that. Have you got any other upcoming talks that you want to mention, or any YouTube videos to plug or anything like that?
Well, I have a YouTube channel, and it's Cathi Morgan. That's CATHIMORGAN. So that's got most of my presentations and interviews on a playlist on that channel.
Okay.
Yeah, people are interested in looking into that.
Did you ever know Max Spears?
Yeah, I didn't know him well. We communicated a couple of times. That's all. Yeah, that's tragic.
I mean, I'm just wondering how his story fits into everything else we've spoken about today in terms of targeted individuals and those who appear to have surveillance on them the whole time, and the key to it would appear to be their family backgrounds and the bloodline that they're born into. I'm just wondering how his story connects into all of this, if it does in any way.
Yeah, it seems like he was more on the sort of super soldier type of side of things. And he was lived in the States as well, didn't he? Or was it Canada? I think it was the States or Canada as a child. So it was a different thing, really.
And Sarah Adams was his partner, right? Who's going to be speaking at AwakeCon as well?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
How did BASES go? You're at BASES conference this year, right?
Oh, it was great. It was BASES in Dublin, in Ireland. And I've just come back, actually. I spoke on Sunday.
Right.
It was just fantastic. People flew in from Canada and from Holland, and somebody flew in from LA. So it garnered a lot of international attention. Of course, Kerry Cassidy was involved in that conference. So she arranged for Daniel List to have a link. He's called Dark Journalist. A Skype link. So he did a Skype presentation, and there was a great feeling of, cooperation, like sort of coming together of people from quite a lot of different countries.
So I know you've got a blog, a WordPress blog, but you've not posted to it for quite some time. Is that something you hope to get back to doing regularly soon?
Yeah, I've had quite major disruptions in attempting to move to Ireland. I'm settled now and things have worked out beautifully, but there was a couple of hairy years there where I was quite, financially challenged and so on. So I didn't have the time and energy to do it. But now I want to get my blog sort of into some shape and post my latest stuff. I haven't published any of my latest stuff for a couple of years yet, so that's in the pipeline.
Okay.
Oh, the blog is at WordPress, isn't it? It's cathki.wordpress.com.
Okay. And is there anything we've not covered in our conversation today that you'd like to add, or have we pretty much covered it all?
I think we've covered a good overview of stuff there. It's been really interesting talking to you. You've filled me in on a few bits there that I didn't know about like Syd Barrett's father, for example. So I'll be looking into that.
All right, Cathi, thanks for coming on Good Vibrations today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been great. Thanks.
This is just for vibrations. I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up